Today we will just be doing a talk. We'll have no panelist, and the theme is, the fact I have a PowerPoint is shocking to me alone, but if it were a proper one, I suppose we'd say 10 principles from Jesus for your job, or 10 principles for working, or 10 words from Jesus on your job, if we want to allude to Moses just a wee bit. So, first principle, not surprisingly, is love the Lord your God. The full commandment, as you will recall, is love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and strength. Jesus sees that rightly as a distillation of the whole law. And of course, if you've been in a Christian college or seminary, they love the part about loving God with your mind, given that for many decades, some conservative Christians seem to think that was somehow a violation of God's will, that if you're going to do something in the intellectual realm, the stupider the better. But in fact, that's not what Jesus said. And the heart, as we pour our whole lives into God, that's popular in worship-focused traditions, and that's certainly something we want to affirm. Your soul really can be translated your life, your whole life, which would serve our purposes. But I think loving God with all your strength is something that I've found particularly pertinent to work, because where else but work would you really love God with all your strength? But when Jesus said this, I think he's talking about that life energy you've got to expend. And as I indicated, where do you expend it more than in the workplace? But each of us has this energy that we're meant to pour into life. And as I've said, 40 plus hours a week is devoted to your work. And so loving God with all your strength it just must mean loving God in and through the work you do. Whatever you're doing, as Paul says, we're cheating a little here. This is the Gospels, and Jesus did say this and affirm this as a command. But Paul said, whatever you do in word or in deed, do it with all your heart as unto the Lord. And he immediately follows with a particular workplace application, right? Don't do it with eye service to please men and women. Do it from the heart as in the presence of God. And that's perhaps the simplest way to understand the relationship of this command, loving God with all your strength, and your work, is if you do it in the presence of God, aware that God is watching, then I think everything else we'll talk about on this list and things we couldn't include in this list are naturally going to be unfolding out of that basic commitment, right? You all know how it is when the inspector's coming. So if you've been in the military, and that's a time of particular intensity, right? Likewise, if the big boss, if you're in a major corporation, the big boss is coming to visit the factory. Oh, all hands on deck, everything's got to be perfect. If you're a teacher and it's time for your annual or triannual evaluation, and there is a colleague or colleagues or administrators out there in the classroom, that's when you have your PowerPoint ready and your power tie on, and you try to put together a professional presentation for an hour and a half, perhaps for the first time in years, because you're being held to account. And so one of the reasons it's good to start your day with prayer and pray regularly is, yes, we cry out to God for strength and wisdom as we always do, but just to remind yourself in whose presence you're always working. When you remember that, I think the other things, as I've said, are going to flow naturally. So this is part of the great commandment in general. What's the heart of the law, they ask? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength. And this is really the greatest commandment for work, therefore, as well. You will also recall, if you're an adept at the Bible, that there's a second commandment which is like it. And that's love your neighbor as yourself. But this really helps the outward dimension. So if you've got the idea that you're living in God's presence, everything you do is in a basic sense for Him. What's your horizontal directive as you look at the other human beings around you? Let's love your neighbor as yourself. And again, this would really enfold everything you do in the workplace, so that all the rest of the commandments we're looking at today, or the orientations to life, are going to flow out of this, but I'll just break it down into two basic components. First of all, you want to love God in the work you do. And this is probably the one where most Christians need to think harder about the relationship of that to their work, that doing good work is how you are more often than not a good neighbor. It's not the only way you're a good neighbor, but it's a critical way you're a good neighbor. So let's think of a personal financial advisor, right? Young family thinking about buying a house. They've got one job and one of them's at home with the 3 kids and they don't have a lot of money, but they do want to be shrewd with it in the best sense, and so they are entrusting you to give them good advice. That's a pretty big responsibility when you think about it. In fact, it's such a big responsibility, probably if you're a financial advisor, you can't think about it all the time. Just as if you're a physician, you can't constantly think, oh, if I cut this guy's aorta by accident, he's going to die and I'm going to lose. You just couldn't go on. You just kind of get into it. And sure, you got legal responsibilities and principles and company rules that help you to deal more responsibly. But if you just are a rule follower, you're going to miss the joy of thinking, what am I really doing is I'm helping my neighbor figure out what to do with this, what in some ways seems like a small investment compared to these big accounts you might have, but that's their life or a substantial part of it, and they've put it in your hands. So you slipping them a gospel tract or promising to pray for them, that's great, but what they really need from you is sound financial advice. That's why they're there. If you're construction and you're building front steps for someone, you want to build them well, because if you don't and the brick crumbles and the guy's rushing out to work, steps, breaks his leg, loses his job, right? That could be because you didn't do your job properly. And the fact you give him a big hug at the worship service is at that point kind of irrelevant to what you've done to this person's life. I mean, mistakes happen, et cetera, but you want to make a good faith effort to do your job well, because that's how you love your neighbor. But of course, and we're typically, I think as Christians, better at this part, it's also the way you do your work, your attentiveness to others. For many of us, it's how we treat our coworkers. We've all been in situations where our life has become a nightmare because of, ill relationship with coworkers. And we have to ask, to what extent do we foster that kind of an environment, either by a withdrawal and inaction, or by actively gossiping or treating people with lack of courtesy, lack of respect. Those things can poison a workplace environment. And so we want to be attentive to the people around us, praying for them, talking with them, genuinely concerned for their well-being. Our next couple of principles, think about the Sermon on the Mount. I selected just 2, though, out of that, all the things that might be applied from the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' ethical teaching in general. And the first one is pretty simple: be honest. It says, be honest. Let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. Jesus is saying by that we need to be people of integrity, and particularly that means the specific context is not swearing oaths, which seems a little archaic to us, but the point is that Jesus says you shouldn't have to be such a fundamentally dishonest person that on the rare occasions you're telling the truth, you have to say, oh, I swear to God, because usually you can't trust a word I say. But in this one instance, I'm reliable. Jesus like, that's insane. You need to be honest people whose words and deeds line up, but particularly whose inner disposition and intent matches up with what you say. Ironic instance of this, which we may have alluded to in past classes, are the Quakers, who way back, and to this day, but way back in the 1600s, placed such a high value on truth and transparency in their communities that they ended up becoming wonderful business people. You know, your Quaker Oats chap that you might have sojourned with this morning, and his little hat and everything, that goes right all the way back to the early days, I think, of Pennsylvania. which was founded by the Quaker William Penn. And the colony quickly became prosperous, both because of its fortuitous situation there with abundant agricultural resources and ports and all the things you need. But people loved to do business with the Quakers because they were just so honest. I think it's particularly lucid in terms of trade, that economic endeavor where honesty becomes critical. But you think, again, day to day, every job you do depends on the integrity of yourself and the people around you. Yeah? Again, there are laws in place, and you can have suits and countersuits and all that sort of thing. But most transactions, and even most everyday mundane dealings in the workplace, require and are based on fundamental commitments of honesty. One more related item from Jesus' ethical watchwords, and that is, watch your words. Be careful of what you say. Pretty close to when Jesus says this business about yes or no. He says, but I say to you, everyone who's angry with his brother or sister shall be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother shall be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, shall be liable to the hell of fire. And this is part of general exhortation by Jesus, James, his brother, and the whole New Testament, that what comes out of our mouths, and nowadays what emerges from our fingers, is just absolutely critical, and no more critical than in the workplace. One employer I know of says, every time you type an email, imagine it's going to be on the front page of the New York Times. Jesus said, what you whisper in the closets will be shouted from the rooftops. And of course, with some of these major corporations, that's precisely what happens. The lawyer subpoenas the emails, and your little jokey or mean-spirited or ill-advised revelation about something to do with the company suddenly becomes public business. Think carefully what you've written and really whether you want to say that. So you don't want to just flame on because you're upset. Get quiet in your heart. Think about what you want to write. Write carefully. Read it again. Send it to a trusted friend to say, you think this is too much? You got to use all the possible tools before you hit that send button. So that's point 4. I'm going to transition out of the ethical dimension a little bit now and try to get some perspective on our work. And one critical thing that was helpful to learn in this Theology of Work project as we were looking at the Gospels was that your space is his space, which I think we generally know, but including your workspace, that you don't enter into some godless bubble when you enter your office or whatever your domain of endeavor is. Now, it may feel like a godless bubble, but in fact, it's not the case. And it's interesting to read the Gospels with that lens in mind. So think of the calling of Matthew, one of my most meaningful stories for me, because after I read the Sermon on the Mount and said Jesus spoke with authority, it's the first time I'd ever read it when I was 18 years old or so. And I said, yeah, he spoke with authority. And then he calls Matthew, says, you follow me. And I said, all right. And of course, there's a wonderful Rembrandt painting where Jesus is coming by Matthew's office. He's in his tax office, according to the Gospels. We could imagine it might be a fishing rights thing right by the lake, and maybe it's just a ramshackle affair. Or if you want to think of him in a cubicle with his little headset on and dealing with the IRS and this guy, that guy, however you want to picture it, Jesus invades his workspace. There's just no way around it. That's where he calls Matthew to come and follow him and write the first gospel and do all the other things that Matthew did. That happened in the workplace. Likewise, Peter and his friends. Now, there was clearly an incremental process with them, so they were hanging around John the Baptist, and then they hung around with Jesus, etc. But we know that one of the critical moments in their decision to follow Jesus comes in their workplace, their boats. Right? That's their job. And Jesus just waltzes right in and says, I got another job for you. Now, Does that mean, therefore, that your whole goal in life, and work particularly, is evangelism morning, noon, and night? No. But it does mean that as you're praying in your car or by your bedside in the morning and doing, as we said in step one, opening your life to the presence of God, doesn't stop when you're there at work. Yeah? That everything you do is going to be conditioned by the fact that Jesus really is present there in your workplace. And he is just as much Lord there as he is anywhere else. Your space is his space, including your workspace. Next one is you're not making a living. God is giving you life. Now, I fully realize that language works a certain way, and we use this expression, making a living, and that's fine. You don't feel guilty if you say that. Nonetheless, that can easily lead to the sense, and we're often enwrapped in the idea that somehow it's up to us to provide for ourselves in a pretty absolute fashion. And Christians can fall into that just as much as anybody else. But Jesus is the one who said, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you shall eat or what you shall drink, nor about your body, what you shall put on. Isn't life more than food and body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And which of you, by being anxious, can add 1 cubit to his span of life? Consider the lilies of the field. They neither toil nor spin, yet Solomon in all his glory was not clothed as one of them. Consider the sparrows," right? You're worth more than many sparrows, Jesus says. Now, it is, of course, the case that sparrows and lilies, in one sense, don't have to work. God just provides for them. They're not engaged in conscious economic activity, putting on their little sparrow suits and driving in little sparrow cars to work and flying around negotiating the price of random bits of food on the ground. They don't work in that sense, but they might say that they work a little hard and they're chirping and flitting about and food gathering and everything. Nonetheless, there's a sense in which God just provides for them, and we have to take a more active role. And Jesus certainly recognizes that. He's not telling people not to work, but I do think he's saying that ultimately all things are a gift from God, including your ability to work. And so it's not really a paradox, it's just the way life is. We might, if we think a certain way, we can think of it as a paradox. We just have to affirm the fact that God is ultimately providing everything we have, and we work hard, make prudential decisions, are responsible in our duties, and in that sense we could say we're making a living, we're working hard, we're pouring ourselves into what we do, but we need to take it as God's gift to us and not as something we're laying hold of independently. The primal sin way back in the garden is the illusion of radical autonomy, that I can separate myself from God, make my own judgments, I'm going to work in my own strength, that it's just me, me, me. And that's a complete delusion. Everything we have is a gift from the Creator and Sustainer God through Christ. And your job is equally provision from Him, not something you achieve for yourself. It's a gift. And that's the beauty of life, is you take it as a gift and you pour yourself into it with all the strength that you have. Now, related to that is, and the logical conclusion is, you also don't worry about your work. You don't approach your work with a sense of daily anxiety that if you don't perform, then somehow it's not going to all come through for you. You do it as trusting in God's provision. Number 8, renew faith by doing new things in the world. When Jesus feeds the 5,000, okay, fair enough, he's got the loaves, he's got the fishes, but really that's a pretty spectacular new thing, and it just blew people's minds that God, who created the world, well, those who had eyes to see, not many at that point in the narrative, God, who had created the world out of nothing, is still at work to do new things in the world, even with just a couple of loaves and fishes. And so, to the extent that your work involves what I'm going to call sub-creating new things, so we talk about creative work, and it is creative, but remembering that it's God whose power is at work in and through us. They're not creative in a Prometheus independent sense of we're doing all this. We're sub-creating, as Tolkien says, and that's a worthy thing. And when we participate wholeheartedly in sub-creating new things, whether it's ships or engines or works of art, we remind people about the God who created all things in the beginning. And we don't remind them of just by leaving a tract under their keyboard. We remind them by the reality that's emerging through our common efforts. And as God permits, we can help identify why this is just so amazing. Secondly, in this little subset of things, restoring hope by restoring the world. To the extent that things are broken in the world and we help fix them, on the one hand, we are thereby affirming the goodness of creation and pointing to God as creator. When we mend broken bones or we help mend broken hearts, we fix cars, we fix clocks, whatever it is we're doing, it does help point backwards. But I think even more, it gives people hope because it points towards the restoration of all things in the new heavens and new earth. And again, that's something you can talk to people about, and because it's true, and because the Holy Spirit can impress that on people's hearts, people can learn. If you just tell them God's going to restore all things one day, that could be a transformative experience for people. But when you look at Jesus' own ministry, he did say that, more or less, a lot, but more often he enacted it, particularly in the healing miracles. Remember our quote, which we shared in one of the first two classes from Jurgen Moltmann. Jesus' healings are not supernatural acts in a natural world. They're the only natural thing in a world that's unnatural, demonized, and wounded. And if you know anything about Moltmann as a theologian, you know he is all about hope. It's his first major landmark book is The Theology of Hope, looking forward to the restoration of all things. And again, as you take care of a problem in human resources, somebody's fallen ill and you help facilitate their recovery, or you're the doctor who, to a certain extent, enacts that recovery. For the Christian, doing that in the present broken world is always done in hope, and is therefore a part of our gospel presentation. Now, I'm going to be drawing here ever so briefly on the Gospel of John, because throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus is working. And if you just go look through you could get a concordance or something or search program, but it's just to read John repeatedly and keep your eye out for the words doing and work. And you'll see it's just all through the Gospel. Just constantly, Jesus is working. My Father is working until now, and I am working. And what are his final words in John's Gospel on the cross? It is finished. What's finished? The work the Father gave him to do. So, Jesus, in one sense, does what we can't do. So I don't want to just say whatever Jesus does, we do exactly the same thing. We don't die for the sins of the world. But Jesus also does what we must do. He really is our model. Jesus is faithful witness in what he says, but equally in what he does, right up to the end of his life, is, I think, one of those things in the Gospels which is deliberately held out to us as an example. That's why Jesus himself could say, the one who endures to the end or perseveres to the end, that's the one who's going to be saved. And why Jesus in the upper room in that same Gospel commissions his disciples to go into the world, even as he was sent into the world. The world that hates him and the world that hates them is also the object of his mission and his love, and therefore needs to be the object of the mission and love of the disciples. And to the extent that we are his disciples, we need to do the same. So it's important that we love God with all our heart, love our neighbor as ourselves. All the rest of the stuff, in one sense, was commentary on that. And the final word is just keep doing that. Keep loving God, keep loving your neighbor until the end, and he will richly reward you for that.